Amidst the mist-shrouded battlefields of Europe, a chilling legend persists, one of an army that vanishes and reappears without a trace. For centuries, soldiers have reported seeing ghostly figures, their armor gleaming in the dim light of dawn, marching with precision before disappearing into thin air. Known only as the Phantom Army, this mysterious battalion has defied explanation, slipping through time like a shadow. Was it merely a product of battlefield madness, or was there something far more profound at play? The question endures. Could this ghostly army still be watching, waiting for the right moment to rise again? The mist hung heavily over the battlefield, a thick blanket of fog that obscured the view of the soldiers who had once fought here. The ground was silent, save for the distant calls of birds and the whispering wind that seemed to carry with it the faintest echo of a long-forgotten war. It was the perfect setting for a tale of mystery, a haunting whisper that refused to die. For centuries, there have been rumors of a battalion that never truly vanished, an army that appeared and disappeared at will, an unstoppable force that slipped through time like a ghost. This is the legend of the Phantom Army, Europe's most enduring military enigma. But could this really be more than just a story, more than folklore passed down through generations? What if the Phantom Army is not just a shadow of history, but a living, breathing mystery that still lingers on the edges of our understanding? These questions have puzzled historians, conspiracy theorists, and those who are simply drawn to the unknown. The idea of an army that vanishes and reappears is a concept that touches on something deeper, something primal in human nature, a need to believe that there are things beyond our comprehension, forces at play that we cannot control. At the heart of this mystery is an unsettling question. How is it that an army could simply vanish? Entire battalions, soldiers in their prime, equipped with weapons and armor, disappearing without a trace. In the annals of history, there are few accounts as strange, few that continue to echo through time with such weight and mystery. For centuries, tales have circulated about the Phantom Army, a ghostly battalion that has somehow slipped through the cracks of history. Some believe it was a medieval force, others a group from the Renaissance. But one thing remains constant across all accounts. The army's disappearance is as inexplicable as it is chilling. In the fog of war, it's not uncommon for armies to be lost. Wars are chaotic, filled with confusion, fear, and the kind of violence that erases all traces of the past. But the Phantom Army was no ordinary force. Its disappearance wasn't just the result of a battle gone wrong or a tactical retreat. It was something much more profound. It was as if the very essence of the army had been erased from existence, leaving behind only whispers and rumors. Some say it was magic. Others claim it was an ancient secret, a force beyond human understanding that allowed the battalion to vanish without a trace. But one thing is certain. This army left no conventional evidence of its passing. The first known accounts of the Phantom Army date back to the 14th century, a time when Europe was embroiled in war, religious upheaval, and the rise and fall of empires. During this time, the concept of ghost armies was not entirely unheard of. Stories of spectral soldiers marching across the fields of battle were common, especially in a time when belief in the supernatural was deeply ingrained in the European consciousness. However, the Phantom Army stood out even among these tales. What made it so extraordinary was the consistency of the stories and the eerie detail in which it appeared, both in legend and in the fragmented historical record. One of the most haunting elements of the Phantom Army's legend is its connection to certain battlefields in Europe. These were not just ordinary places of conflict. They were sites where the bloodshed had been so intense, so violent, that the very earth seemed to absorb the spirits of those who fought and died there. But it wasn't just the dead who lingered on these fields. The accounts described the Phantom Army appearing in moments of great need, at times when a particular battle was on the verge of being lost. In some cases, soldiers on the front lines would report seeing ghostly figures, armed warriors who seemed to appear out of nowhere, as if summoned by the very will of the battlefield itself. But as quickly as they arrived, these mysterious figures would vanish, leaving the soldiers who witnessed them shaken and bewildered. Were these soldiers simply hallucinating, driven mad by the horrors of war? Or was there something more at play here, something beyond the realm of human understanding? The idea of an army that could appear and disappear at will has sparked countless theories, many of which point to an ancient knowledge, a forgotten technology, or even some kind of supernatural force that allowed these soldiers to exist outside the boundaries of time and space. For centuries, the Phantom Army remained little more than a curious footnote in the annals of history. But as time passed, more and more people began to claim to have witnessed the reappearance of these spectral soldiers. During World War I, soldiers on both sides reported seeing strange formations of troops on the horizon, marching in perfect alignment, their faces obscured by the fog of war. They appeared to be a distant memory of an earlier age, yet their presence was undeniable. Many believed these soldiers were remnants of the Phantom Army, summoned once more to fight a battle that was not their own. This was not just a case of superstition. These were seasoned soldiers, men who had seen the horrors of war firsthand and were not easily shaken by mere ghosts. Yet, time and time again, these witnesses swore that they had seen something that defied explanation, an army that seemed to exist on the edges of reality, slipping in and out of existence as though it were part of a different dimension. And this is where the mystery deepens. The question arises, was the Phantom Army truly just a product of the human imagination, a myth created to explain the unexplainable, or was there something else behind these sightings? What if the Phantom Army was not just an army of the past, but a force that exists in the present as well, one that has somehow managed to remain hidden from the eyes of the world? Could it be that this army has continued to operate in the shadows, its movements cloaked by the passage of time and the veil of secrecy? The further we delve into this mystery, the more questions arise. Were the soldiers who appeared on the battlefield truly ghosts, or were they something else entirely? Some have suggested that the Phantom Army was the product of an ancient military strategy, a force created not to fight in the conventional sense, but to strike fear into the hearts of enemies by exploiting the power of myth. Perhaps the army was never truly gone, but had simply mastered the art of remaining invisible, operating in the background of history, influencing events without ever being fully seen. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain. The legend of the Phantom Army has endured for centuries, refusing to be erased by time. It has become a part of Europe's collective consciousness, a tale that continues to intrigue and unsettle those who hear it. In the fog of war, where history and myth intertwine, the Phantom Army remains a powerful symbol of the unknown, a reminder that some forces in history cannot be so easily understood, and that the boundaries between the living and the dead are often far more porous than we like to believe. As we explore the mysteries surrounding the Phantom Army, we are left with a profound sense of unease. What if, just beyond the veil of history, this army is still watching, waiting, and perhaps even preparing to return? In the deepest corners of Europe's battlefields, where the past and present converge, the Phantom Army's legend lives on. And with it, the question remains, could the Ghost Battalion, which has eluded capture for centuries, still be out there, waiting for its next call to action? This is a story that refuses to be silenced. The legend of the Phantom Army continues to linger in the air like the fog over those ancient battlefields, a mystery that challenges everything we know about history, time, and the forces that shape our world. Whether you believe in the supernatural or view it as a mere tale of myth and folklore, one thing is certain. The Phantom Army is a story that will not go away. It is a story that demands to be told, a story that forces us to question the very nature of reality itself. The Phantom Army, it seems, is more than just a ghost from the past. It is a presence that continues to haunt the present, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself once more. The story of the Phantom Army cannot be fully understood without first exploring the complex and turbulent history of Europe, a continent steeped in war, political intrigue, and ever-shifting alliances. Europe's past provides the backdrop for one of the most enduring and chilling military mysteries in history. The rise of powerful empires, the fall of civilizations, and the constant battle for dominance left behind a legacy of violence and unrest that paved the way for the creation of the enigmatic force known only as the Phantom Army. To understand how such a battalion could exist, we must first examine the broader historical context in which it was born. Europe, in the centuries leading up to the 14th century, was a land of constant upheaval. The fall of the Roman Empire had left a vast power vacuum, one that would take centuries to fill. During this time, kingdoms and empires rose and fell like tides upon a restless sea. The power struggles between these forces were not only political, but deeply intertwined with the religious and cultural fabric of the continent. The Catholic Church held immense sway, often dictating the direction of wars and influencing the very course of history. The Crusades, for example, not only represented a religious struggle, but also a battle for control of land and resources, bringing together diverse armies of various kingdoms, each one vying for dominance over the Holy Lands. Yet, as one empire fell, another would rise to take its place, and with each passing year, the military landscape of Europe became more complex and fragmented. The Middle Ages were marked by a series of bloody conflicts, territorial disputes, and ever-shifting alliances that left the people of Europe living in constant fear of war. The great kingdoms of France, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire fought not only each other, but also a growing number of smaller, lesser-known kingdoms and factions. Among these groups were mercenaries, soldiers who fought for pay rather than loyalty or nationality, whose presence on the battlefield further complicated the ever-changing dynamics of warfare. These mercenaries, often seeking the highest bidder, were not bound by any moral or national code. They fought for wealth, power, and glory, making them unpredictable and dangerous forces on the battlefield. The volatile nature of medieval European politics, combined with the influence of powerful monarchs and religious figures, created the perfect storm for the emergence of the Phantom Army. However, it was not just the battles fought on the field that shaped Europe's turbulent history. The continent's rich tradition of folklore, myth, and superstition also played a crucial role in shaping the way these conflicts were perceived. During this time, the boundaries between the real and the supernatural were far less defined than they are today. The people of Europe, steeped in religious fervor, believe in the power of divine intervention and supernatural forces. Saints, angels, and demons were thought to be active participants in the daily lives of ordinary people. These beliefs extended to the battlefield, where it was not uncommon for soldiers to invoke the help of saints or the divine before engaging in battle. Supernatural events were often used to explain strange occurrences on the battlefield, from sudden storms to inexplicable victories or defeats. It is in this context that the concept of ghostly battalions began to take shape. For centuries, rumors swirled of armies that appeared out of nowhere, soldiers who fought in battles but were never seen again, who vanished as quickly as they had arrived. Some believed these soldiers were the spirits of those who had died in battle, returning to continue the fight for their lost cause. Others speculated that these armies were not made up of the dead at all, but of living men who had been mysteriously transported through time and space. The idea of soldiers who could transcend the boundaries of life and death was not so far-fetched in a time when the line between the supernatural and the natural world was blurred. The belief in such forces was so deeply ingrained that it is no surprise that the idea of a phantom army took hold. As we move further into the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, the situation in Europe grows even more chaotic. The 100 Years' War between England and France was one of the defining conflicts of the time, a brutal and prolonged struggle for control of territories in France. The war, which lasted from 1337 to 1453, saw the rise of powerful military leaders, many of whom were legendary figures in their own right. Joan of Arc, one of the most famous military leaders in history, claimed to have been guided by visions of saints, and it was her divine intervention that inspired French soldiers to fight with renewed fervor. Whether her visions were the result of true supernatural experiences or the product of mental illness is still a subject of debate, but her influence on the war was undeniable. The idea of divine or supernatural guidance was a powerful tool for military leaders during this time, and many believe that armies could be bolstered by forces beyond the mortal realm. While Joan of Arc's story is one of the more famous examples of the intersection between war and the supernatural, there were many others who believed in the existence of forces that could tip the scales of battle. In a time when information traveled slowly and many battles were fought in relative obscurity, rumors often spread about ghostly armies appearing at the most crucial moments, tipping the balance in favor of one side or another. In many cases, these ghostly forces were said to have been summoned by powerful leaders or shamans who believed that they could channel the energy of the dead to fight on their behalf. These rumors, of course, were often dismissed as superstition, but they were persistent, continuing to circulate long after the battles were over. As the Renaissance dawned, Europe saw the rise of powerful new rulers and military leaders, such as Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, Henry VIII of England, and Francis I of France. The power dynamics of Europe were shifting, and with them, the nature of warfare. New technologies, such as gunpowder and cannons, were introduced to the battlefield, changing the way battles were fought. Yet, despite these advancements, the belief in supernatural forces and the power of myth did not fade. In fact, the concept of the Phantom Army seemed to grow stronger, as if feeding off the turbulence and uncertainty of the times. The old legends persisted, and new ones were born, further entwining the idea of a ghostly battalion with the turbulent political and military landscape of Europe. Throughout all of this, the story of the Phantom Army remained a shadow on the edge of history, a haunting, elusive figure that refused to be fully understood. As the centuries passed, the legend continued to evolve, taking on new forms and interpretations. The concept of a spectral army appeared in various cultures, but nowhere more prominently than in Europe, where the history of war and myth collided in a way that no other continent could replicate. The Phantom Army became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that history is not always written in clear lines, but often in the blurry shadows between what we know and what we believe. The key to understanding the Phantom Army lies in this combination of historical chaos and the powerful human need to believe in something greater than the mortal world. The story of the Phantom Army is not just a tale of military might, but a story about the way humanity grapples with the unknown, the supernatural, and the unexplained. It is the story of an army that never truly existed, and yet, in some strange and inexplicable way, it continues to fight its battles in the realms of myth and memory. As the centuries go by, the lines between history and legend blur, and the Phantom Army becomes more than just a curiosity. It becomes a symbol of the enduring power of myth and mystery, a force that continues to haunt the imagination of all who encounter it. The history of Europe, with all its bloodshed, turmoil, and superstition, laid the perfect foundation for a tale that would live on long after the dust of battle had settled, and the Phantom Army would remain a legend, waiting to be uncovered. The earliest whispers of the Phantom Army stretch back to the 14th century, a time when Europe was a continent caught in the throes of war, famine, and the creeping shadow of the Black Death. This was an era in which supernatural beliefs were deeply entrenched in everyday life, and tales of ghosts and spirits were as common as the wars that ravaged the land. Yet, the story of the Phantom Army is one that stands out among these supernatural tales, not just because of the eerie nature of the soldiers who were said to appear and disappear at will, but because of the sheer consistency and detail of the accounts surrounding them. As much as the notion of ghostly battalions seems like an impossible fantasy, the stories of the Phantom Army seem to have been grounded in something far more tangible, something that refuses to fade into myth and legend. It was in the midst of the 100 Years' War, that long and bloody conflict between England and France, that the first recorded sightings of the Phantom Army emerged. The war itself, a struggle for control of the French throne, brought with it a staggering loss of life and created an environment rife with superstition. Armies clashed on the fields of battle, each side more desperate than the last. It was during these dark and uncertain times that strange stories began to circulate. Soldiers spoke of figures appearing on the edges of battlefields, of ghostly warriors who seemed to rise from the earth itself, rallying to the side of the beleaguered French or English forces. These sightings were not limited to a single battle or skirmish, but were described in various parts of Europe, suggesting that the Phantom Army had an almost omnipresent quality, able to appear at will when the need was greatest. At first, these reports were dismissed by many as the result of battlefield madness. In the heat of battle, when fear and exhaustion blurred the line between reality and hallucination, it was not uncommon for soldiers to believe they had seen something supernatural. The sounds of clashing swords, the pounding of hooves, the thundering of cannons, it all created a disorienting environment in which strange phenomena could be easily misunderstood. But there was something about the accounts of the Phantom Army that seemed different. These soldiers were not merely the figments of tired minds. They were described with remarkable consistency. They were always warriors of immense discipline, moving with military precision, as if they were a fully formed army rather than disjointed visions. The figures appeared in full regalia, their armor gleaming in the dim light of dawn or dusk, as if they had stepped from the pages of some forgotten battle. One of the first recorded instances of the Phantom Army came from the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. It was a turning point in the 100 Years' War, where the French forces suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the English. According to some reports, as the French army prepared for their final stand, strange figures appeared on the horizon, marching in tight formation. Some claimed they were spectral soldiers who emerged from the mist, while others said they saw warriors with no faces, only shadows, moving silently across the field. Whether these figures actually fought in the battle or merely observed it from the fringes is still a point of contention, but the legend took root in the minds of those who had witnessed the strange occurrences. In the years that followed, more and more soldiers began to claim they had seen similar figures at other battles, phantom armies that seemed to appear just when they were needed most. Despite the fear and confusion surrounding these sightings, the Phantom Army began to take on a mythic quality. It was no longer just an occasional rumor or a battlefield hallucination. It was a force that seemed to transcend the normal laws of time and space. What began as fleeting visions quickly evolved into something far more substantial, a fully realized legend that persisted across centuries. As the 100 Years' War continued to rage on, stories of the Phantom Army spread throughout France, England, and beyond. These soldiers were not bound by earthly constraints. They could vanish as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind only whispers and rumors, a trail of mystery that no one could fully explain. But as with any great legend, the truth behind the Phantom Army remained elusive. The more people tried to understand it, the more questions arose. Were these ghostly soldiers simply the product of overactive imaginations, fueled by the stress and horrors of war? Or is there something deeper at play? Some historians believe that the idea of the Phantom Army was born out of a need for hope in times of extreme despair. The soldiers, tired and battered by endless conflict, may have looked to the supernatural as a way of explaining what they could not understand. In a time when divine intervention was often seen as a solution to earthly problems, the appearance of an army sent from the heavens could provide comfort to those facing certain defeat. But even as these explanations took hold, the mystery only deepened. How could so many soldiers from different regions and different battles describe the same figures, the same eerie sensations, unless there was something truly extraordinary happening? The earliest descriptions of the Phantom Army paint a picture of warriors who were both unsettling and awe-inspiring. They were not like any army of the living, and yet they were undeniably real to those who saw them. Soldiers spoke of the way these figures moved, silent, but with an air of absolute discipline. Some described them as being clad in armor that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, while others claimed they saw no faces, only shadows where faces should have been. Despite their ghostly appearance, these soldiers were often described as possessing an otherworldly strength, as though they were not merely the spirits of the dead, but living warriors trapped in an eternal struggle. Their presence was a source of both fear and awe, for they seemed to transcend the normal rules of nature. The tales of the Phantom Army were not confined to a single battle or even a single war. As the centuries passed, reports continued to surface from other conflicts. During the Wars of the Roses in England, soldiers once again spoke of spectral forces appearing on the battlefield, their presence often tipping the scales of battle in favor of one side or the other. The figures were always the same: well-disciplined, efficient, and seemingly invincible. Even as gunpowder weapons became more common and the nature of warfare evolved, the stories of the Phantom Army persisted. They appeared in moments of great need, when a particular battle seemed lost or hopeless. Was this a coincidence, or was there something deliberate about their appearances? One of the most striking features of the Phantom Army is its ability to remain consistent in its form and function, despite the changing face of warfare. Even as armies became more technologically advanced and the nature of combat evolved, the Phantom Army seemed to retain its ability to appear at the most critical junctures in history. In the 17th century, as Europe plunged into the chaos of the 30 Years' War, soldiers once again spoke of spectral forces appearing on the battlefield, this time in the form of ethereal soldiers clad in the armor of the time. In some cases, these figures were said to have appeared just before the tide of battle turned, giving one side an unexpected advantage. These reports continued into the 19th century, when the Napoleonic Wars swept across Europe. Even then, soldiers spoke of ghostly armies emerging from a mist, moving with incredible precision and skill. The descriptions remained largely the same: phantoms with no faces, armored warriors marching in perfect formation. The very consistency of these accounts across different periods of history is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the Phantom Army legend. How could soldiers from different time periods, facing different armies and different enemies, describe the same strange occurrences unless there was something real behind these sightings? Were these soldiers simply drawing from the same reservoir of fear and superstition, or was there some deeper, more tangible force at play? The story of the Phantom Army is not just one of military mystery. It is also a story about the way humanity grapples with the unknown. In the face of war and death, the human mind often seeks explanations for the things it cannot understand. The idea of a ghostly army appearing in times of need offers comfort to those who are struggling with the brutality of war. It suggests that, in the darkest moments of human history, there may be a force beyond our comprehension that steps in to restore balance, even if only for a fleeting moment. Whether the Phantom Army was truly a supernatural force or simply a product of collective imagination, its legend continues to haunt the fringes of history, a reminder of the mysteries that still lie hidden in the depths of the past. Even today, the stories persist. Though we may never know the full truth behind the Phantom Army, its legend endures as a testament to the power of myth and the human need to believe in something greater than the mundane world around us. And perhaps, in some small way, that is the greatest mystery of all: the fact that this ghostly battalion, with its countless appearances across centuries and continents, continues to captivate the imagination of those who hear its tale. As the legend of the Phantom Army grew, so too did the involvement of key historical figures, individuals whose names have echoed through time, becoming synonymous with power, military strategy, and, in some cases, the mysterious forces that shaped Europe's turbulent past. These leaders, some of whom were already steeped in myth and mysticism, seem to be not merely the products of their times, but possibly the unwitting creators or influencers of this ghostly battalion. While the historical record offers us only fragmentary glimpses of their roles in the tale of the Phantom Army, the connections between these figures and the spectral forces that have come to haunt the imagination are undeniable. To truly understand the legend, we must examine these pivotal personalities, many of whom wielded their influence not only through traditional warfare, but also by tapping into the strange and often esoteric currents that ran just beneath the surface of history. One of the first figures whose name is inextricably linked to the Phantom Army is none other than King Charles V of France, a ruler whose reign during the late 14th century was marked by both military and mystical significance. Known as Charles the Wise, He was a monarch who was deeply invested in the art of warfare and military strategy, yet also fascinated by the arcane and supernatural. His reign coincided with the height of the Hundred Years' War, a conflict that defined his rule and shaped much of the future of France. But what makes Charles V particularly interesting in the context of the Phantom Army is not just his political and military prowess. It's his reputed belief in the power of divine intervention and the supernatural. It's said that Charles often sought the counsel of astrologers, alchemists, and mystics to guide him in matters of state and war. These figures, many of whom were adept in the occult sciences, were thought to be able to commune with forces beyond human comprehension, making them invaluable to a king who was fighting not only a foreign enemy, but also the mysterious forces of fate. While there are no direct records that link Charles V to the creation or command of a ghostly battalion, the very nature of his reign set the stage for such stories to take root. The king's fascination with the supernatural was well known. He consulted with seers and astrologers before crucial battles, seeking to gain favor from the heavens. This kind of reliance on supernatural forces was not unusual in medieval Europe, where many leaders, particularly during times of war, believed that the divine could tip the scales in their favor. The idea of an invisible army, perhaps one called forth by the king himself, through occult rituals or divine favor, seems entirely plausible in the context of the time. Could it be that Charles, through his connections with the mystical and the esoteric, inadvertently became the leader of an army not bound by the laws of nature? It's an idea that aligns with the prevailing notions of the time, where armies were not just composed of men, but were also influenced by unseen forces, from the spiritual to the supernatural. Moving forward in time, another figure whose association with the Phantom Army is hard to ignore is the enigmatic military leader, Gilles de Rais. A knight who fought alongside Joan of Arc and gained renown for his bravery during the Hundred Years' War. De Rais was a man of contradictions. On one hand, he was a celebrated war hero, fighting for France in some of its most significant battles. On the other hand, his later years were marred by horrific accusations of ritualistic killings and dark, occult practices. De Rais became notorious not only for his military skill, but also for his reputed dabbling in alchemy and the occult, as well as his association with dark forces that some believed he had used to summon supernatural entities. De Rais's story is one of immense power that seemed to gradually slip into madness. After the war, he grew increasingly obsessed with the idea of summoning demonic forces, attempting to harness the powers of black magic in his pursuit of wealth and immortality. His attempts to create his own magical army of soldiers through occult rituals were documented by those who were close to him, and rumors circulated that he had succeeded in invoking a spectral army to do his bidding. While these claims were never proven, they contributed to the growing legend of an army that could be called forth from the afterlife, one that might be controlled or directed by someone with the right knowledge and power. His story is one of twisted ambition, and while it's uncertain whether de Rais truly created a phantom army of his own, his ties to the occult provide a fascinating parallel to the legend of the Phantom Army. Was it possible that the sinister rituals he performed summoned the very soldiers who later came to be known as phantoms? The lines between reality and myth often blur in the tales surrounding de Rais, making it difficult to separate the man from the mystery. Another name that emerges when considering the Phantom Army's historical roots is the infamous Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Unlike the French king, Charles V was not particularly known for his mystical interests, but he was a ruler at the crossroads of some of Europe's most significant religious and political upheavals. His reign during the 16th century was marked by a fierce struggle between the Catholic Church and the growing influence of Protestant reformers. As a ruler of an empire that stretched across much of Europe, Charles was embroiled in wars on multiple fronts, particularly against the Ottoman Empire and the forces of Protestantism. His military campaigns were legendary. Yet, like Charles V of France, Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire found himself caught in a world teetering between the earthly and the divine. Though there is no direct evidence that Charles V had a personal connection to the Phantom Army, His political and military influence in Europe during his reign laid the groundwork for many of the myths that would later come to surround such mysterious figures. In the context of the endless battles and shifting allegiances, it's not difficult to imagine that some of the supernatural forces attributed to his reign were seen as manifestations of the legendary battalions that appeared in times of need. Could these phantom soldiers, these spectral warriors, have been seen as divine interventions in his battles, especially when key victories seemed impossible? Such stories could easily have been woven into the fabric of history as a way to justify his successes or bolster his image as a leader favored by the gods. Moving beyond these towering historical figures, the tale of the Phantom Army intersects with the realm of secret societies, which were gaining influence in Europe during the Renaissance. During this period, the influence of organizations like the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and other esoteric groups became deeply entwined with the political and military elite. These secret societies were often accused of wielding dark, occult powers that they kept hidden from the public eye. Some historians suggest that the Phantom Army's legend may have been influenced by the rituals and symbols associated with these societies. Could the appearances of ghostly battalions be connected to secretive orders that, through their knowledge of ancient rituals and mystical practices, were able to tap into forces beyond the mortal realm? The Masonic tradition, for example, is steeped in symbolism and mystery, and its members often held positions of power within the military, royal courts, and even the church. Was it possible that these secretive groups used their occult knowledge to summon or manipulate spectral forces, creating the legend of the Phantom Army as a way to exert power over the battlefield? Whether these secret societies truly had the ability to summon such an army remains a subject of intense speculation, but the connections between the esoteric and the military during this time cannot be ignored. The line between history, mysticism, and myth becomes increasingly blurred, and the idea that influential leaders were somehow able to command armies beyond the realm of the living fits within the broader context of the occult practices of the time. Perhaps the most compelling figure in this saga is the mysterious warrior priests of the Renaissance, leaders who were simultaneously steeped in both the martial and religious traditions. Figures like the infamous Cesare Borgia, whose name is synonymous with intrigue, manipulation, and the blurring of morality, wielded not only armies but also the power of the church. Borgia's rise to power within the Vatican is often seen as a testament to his cunning and ruthlessness, but it is also a reflection of the close ties between religious and military authority during this period. Cesare's ambitions went beyond just conquering lands. He sought to conquer the very forces that shaped the world. And it is here, in the intersection of politics, religion, and warfare, that the legend of the Phantom Army seems to have gained traction. While the connection between these historical figures and the Phantom Army is speculative at best, the consistent appearance of these soldiers in the mythological accounts across different periods of history points to something deeper, something that ties these figures to the very fabric of European history itself. Whether through their belief in the occult, their connection to powerful secret societies, or their desperate attempts to gain an upper hand in war, these individuals seem to have inadvertently created the conditions for the emergence of the Phantom Army. The line between history, legend, and the supernatural is often difficult to draw, but it is clear that the figures involved in the tale of the Phantom Army were not merely pawns in history's great game. They were, in many ways, its architects. The tale of the Phantom Army is far more than just a collection of eerie stories passed down through the ages. It is a mystery woven into the fabric of Europe's most crucial wars, where ordinary men found themselves confronted with supernatural forces that could neither be explained nor controlled. The question remains, was the Phantom Army merely a figment of desperate imaginations, a product of the chaos of war and the psychological toll it takes on soldiers, or was there something far more profound at work? As the years wore on, the mystery deepened, and what was once a fleeting rumor soon became a story that historians, soldiers, and even the common folk could not shake. With each passing battle, more accounts surfaced, each one seemingly more vivid and convincing than the last. These accounts were not just the ramblings of superstitious minds. They were often from men of great credibility, seasoned warriors who had fought in numerous campaigns, only to be left dumbfounded by what they saw in the heat of combat. The first real breakthrough in understanding the phenomenon came in the late 16th century, when soldiers on the front lines of the European conflicts began to document their experiences. These documents, though not widely recognized at the time, would later provide crucial insight into the nature of the Phantom Army. Written records from soldiers who had fought during the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century detailed eerie encounters with spectral soldiers. The most compelling of these records came from German and Swedish soldiers, who reported seeing entire regiments of soldiers materialize on the battlefield, only to vanish just as suddenly as they had appeared. One particularly gripping account came from a Swedish soldier, who was part of the military campaign against the Catholic forces in Central Europe. According to his written testimony, his regiment had been in a desperate standoff with enemy troops near a dense forest. The battle had reached a critical point, and the Swedish forces were on the verge of being overwhelmed. In a moment of heightened panic, the soldier described how a mysterious battalion of soldiers appeared from the mist, marching in tight formation, their armor gleaming in the low light of dawn. At first, the Swedish forces assumed they were reinforcements sent by their commanders, but as the figures drew closer, they realized with horror that these soldiers were not only out of place, but were unlike any men they had ever seen. Their faces were indistinct, their movements unervingly synchronized, and their presence was both commanding and unsettling. As the battle raged on, the phantom soldiers advanced toward the front lines with chilling precision, overwhelming the enemy with an almost supernatural force. Yet, just as quickly as they had arrived, the figures vanished back into the mist, leaving only confusion and awe in their wake. The Swedish soldier, having survived the encounter, was left to wonder whether what he had seen was real or just the result of exhaustion and fear. But other soldiers who were present on the battlefield confirmed the bizarre appearance of these spectral warriors, making it clear that this was not merely a hallucination or an isolated incident. This event became one of the most well-documented instances of the Phantom Army appearing on the battlefield. Over the course of several years, more and more soldiers began to report similar sightings, many of which occurred under dire circumstances. The uncanny nature of these sightings, soldiers appearing out of nowhere, their movements impossible to predict, and their vanishing acts leaving no trace, began to take on a life of their own, eventually becoming a central part of the mystery surrounding the Phantom Army. Yet, the more soldiers reported these encounters, the more difficult it became to ignore the possibility that these were not simply delusions or battle-induced hallucinations, but perhaps something far more inexplicable. As these reports spread, the idea of a Phantom Army began to take on a new dimension. No longer just a collection of fleeting moments in history, the Phantom Army began to symbolize something much more significant. It became a representation of the unknown, a force beyond human comprehension, one that seemed to appear at times when it was most needed. The mystery surrounding the Phantom Army grew deeper as more and more accounts flooded in, each one providing a new piece to the puzzle, but never quite revealing the whole picture. Historians began to take notice of the growing body of evidence surrounding the Phantom Army. As the story of the spectral battalion spread across Europe, it was not confined to a single battlefield or a single war. It seemed to appear in moments of great uncertainty, when the balance of power in Europe was at its most fragile. This led many to question whether the Phantom Army was truly a supernatural force, summoned by some unknown power, or whether it was a more earthly phenomenon that had simply been misinterpreted by soldiers desperate to make sense of the chaos around them. One popular theory that emerged during this period was that the Phantom Army was somehow linked to the idea of divine intervention. The belief that God or the supernatural could influence the outcome of battles was deeply ingrained in the minds of soldiers and leaders alike during this time. The appearance of the Phantom Army at critical moments was seen by some as a sign of divine favor, as though the soldiers were being aided by a higher power in their struggles. This theory resonated particularly strongly with those fighting in religious wars, such as the 30 Years' War, where the conflict between Catholics and Protestants was seen as a battle for the soul of Europe itself. If such an army were to appear, it could only be the hand of God intervening on behalf of the righteous. However, not all who encountered the phantom army saw it as a divine force. Many were deeply unsettled by its presence, particularly when the phantom soldiers appeared in situations where no divine logic seemed to apply. For instance, during the English Civil War, soldiers on both sides reported seeing mysterious soldiers appear on the battlefield in the midst of fierce fighting, only to vanish without a trace. In these instances, the phantom army was often seen as an unpredictable force, neither fully aligned with one side nor the other, but rather as an embodiment of something much more complex, a force that existed outside the realm of human understanding, transcending the boundaries of good and evil. In addition to religious theories, there were also suggestions that the phantom army was somehow tied to ancient rituals and forgotten knowledge. As Europe entered the Renaissance, there was a resurgence of interest in the occult, alchemy, and mysticism. Secret societies, such as the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians, gained prominence, and many of their members were rumored to possess esoteric knowledge that could alter the course of events. Some believed that these groups had unlocked the secret to summoning the phantom army, using occult practices to call forth soldiers from beyond the grave. These secret societies were often associated with powerful political and military leaders, and many of the prominent figures of the time, kings, generals, and diplomats, were rumored to be involved in such mysterious rituals. The rise of such secretive organizations added a layer of intrigue to the phantom army legend, and soon the army was no longer just a mysterious force. It became a symbol of hidden knowledge, a power that could be harnessed by those who had access to the right occult teachings. This interpretation of the phantom army tied the legend to a deeper, darker undercurrent of European history, one that suggested that not all of the great events of the past were the result of natural forces, but rather the manipulation of those who held the keys to forbidden knowledge. Despite the numerous theories and accounts surrounding the phantom army, there's been little definitive proof of its existence. No physical evidence has ever been found to support the claims of those who witnessed the spectral soldiers. No weapons, no armor, no remains have ever been recovered from the battlefields where these encounters supposedly took place. Yet the consistency and volume of the reports suggest that there is something undeniably strange about the phenomenon. It is as though the phantom army exists in a space between the real and the imagined, slipping through the cracks of history and leaving behind only fleeting glimpses of its presence. For many, the phantom army remains a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that there are forces at work in the world that we cannot fully comprehend. In times of war and chaos, when the lines between life and death become blurred, it is easy to understand why soldiers would turn to the supernatural for explanations. The phantom army, with its mysterious appearance and sudden disappearance, speaks to something deep within the human psyche, the desire to believe that, even in the darkest of times, there are forces at work that can tilt the scales in our favor, or that there are things in the universe that exist beyond our ability to explain them. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is not the appearance of the phantom army itself, but why it continues to endure as a legend. What is it about this story that continues to captivate the imagination of those who hear it? Is it the idea of a force beyond human understanding, a reminder that history is often shaped by powers we cannot control? Or is it something deeper, something tied to the very nature of war and human conflict, that draws us to the tale of the phantom army again and again? Regardless of the answer, the phantom army remains an enigma, a haunting reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond the edges of our understanding. And as long as these questions remain unanswered, the story of the phantom army will continue to captivate and intrigue, lurking in the shadows of history. The most perplexing aspect of the phantom army legend is not just its sudden appearances during the most critical moments in history, but the profound absence of any coherent explanation for these mysterious soldiers. The more one delves into the accounts of those who claim to have seen the phantom army, the more questions arise. Who were these soldiers? What was their purpose? Where did they come from? And perhaps the most significant question of all, why did they vanish as quickly as they appeared, leaving no trace behind, as if they had never existed at all? The answer to these questions may lie not just in the physical events surrounding these apparitions, but in the cultural, psychological, and even metaphysical forces that permeated Europe during the times these legends first emerged. For much of European history, belief in the supernatural was not just a matter of personal faith, it was woven into the very fabric of society. In the medieval and early modern periods, the divide between the natural and the supernatural was often far more porous than it is today. People did not merely accept the existence of spirits and ghosts. They actively engaged with these unseen forces, often invoking divine or infernal powers to help them in battle or to sway the course of events. The presence of supernatural entities on the battlefield was not considered unusual. In fact, it was almost expected. When soldiers went to war, they were not merely fighting against human opponents. They were also fighting against forces that they believed were guided by supernatural powers, whether for good or ill. The idea of an invisible army, one that could appear in times of dire need to shift the course of a battle, would have seemed entirely plausible within this worldview. But as history marched forward and enlightenment took root, these beliefs in the supernatural began to fade. The rise of scientific thinking, reason, and rationalism sought to explain away what was once considered mystical, and the world became a more predictable, more structured place. Yet, even as the influence of religion and superstition waned, the legends of the phantom army persisted. It is within this tension between the mystical and the rational that the most intriguing aspect of the legend emerges. Was the phantom army a collective manifestation of the fear and desperation of those engaged in endless warfare? Or was there something deeper at play, something that challenged the very fabric of reality itself? Many modern scholars believe that the stories of the phantom army might be the product of psychological phenomena common in wartime, particularly during periods of extreme stress, trauma, and prolonged combat. The trauma experienced by soldiers, combined with the intense pressure and fear of death, could easily lead to hallucinations, altered perceptions, and even shared experiences among groups of soldiers. Soldiers under extreme duress often experience what is known as combat stress, a psychological condition that can induce a variety of symptoms, from vivid hallucinations to a complete breakdown of one's sense of reality. In this light, the appearances of the phantom army might be seen as a collective manifestation of these mental states, visions of soldiers fighting alongside them in a desperate attempt to survive. Moreover, the psychological concept of groupthink could also explain how such a phenomenon might have spread among soldiers. Groupthink occurs when a group of people begins to make decisions based on the desires for harmony and conformity, often ignoring or dismissing contradictory evidence. In the case of the phantom army, the repeated sightings by soldiers across various battlefields might have been reinforced by the shared beliefs of the soldiers themselves. The idea of supernatural forces at play could have taken root in the minds of soldiers, particularly those on the brink of exhaustion, leading to a kind of mass hallucination or collective delusion. In times of great stress, the human mind often seeks to make sense of chaos, and the appearance of ghostly warriors could have provided a sense of solace, as if the divine or supernatural forces were intervening on their behalf. This mass hysteria theory is not without its detractors, however. There are those who argue that the sheer consistency of the reports, their vivid descriptions, and the detailed accounts of these soldiers suggest that something far more concrete than a mere psychological aberration was at play. After all, it is one thing to claim that a few soldiers, in the heat of battle, saw something strange and unexplainable, but it is quite another for these reports to come from so many different sources from different battles, and even from soldiers who had no reason to exaggerate or embellish their experiences. Could these reports really all be the product of mass delusion? Or is it possible that the phantom army was, in fact, something that existed outside the realm of ordinary experience, a force that was simply beyond the understanding of those who encountered it? Some historians have suggested that the phantom army could be the result of a kind of collective cultural memory, a manifestation of the deep fears, hopes, and longings of soldiers throughout history. In this view, the appearances of the Phantom Army are not just hallucinations or divine intervention, but reflections of the collective psyche of Europe at a time when war seemed to be an inescapable part of life. The soldiers of the time, burdened by the horrors of battle, may have created the myth of the Phantom Army as a coping mechanism, a way to give meaning to the senseless violence around them and to provide hope in the darkest of times. The Phantom Army could then be seen as a symbol of something larger, a reminder that even in the chaos of war, there were forces that might come to the aid of the righteous, forces that existed beyond the limits of mortal comprehension. However, not all theories about the Phantom Army are grounded in psychological or cultural explanations. There are those who continue to argue that the sightings of these spectral soldiers are evidence of something far more extraordinary, perhaps even something that transcends the boundaries of time and space. One of the most intriguing theories is that the Phantom Army is somehow linked to the concept of time travel or parallel dimensions. According to this theory, the soldiers who appear on the battlefield are not the ghosts of the past, but beings who have somehow slipped through the cracks of time itself, appearing in critical moments to alter the course of history. The idea that time is not linear, that events from the past can bleed into the present, has fascinated philosophers, scientists, and writers for centuries, and the Phantom Army could be seen as a manifestation of this idea, a crack in the fabric of time that allows these soldiers to appear when they are most needed. The concept of parallel dimensions, realms that coexist alongside our own, yet remain hidden from our perception, has also been proposed as a possible explanation for the Phantom Army. Some believe that the soldiers who appear on the battlefield are not ghosts at all, but beings from another dimension, beings who are able to cross the boundary between their world and ours in moments of crisis. These soldiers might be from a parallel timeline where the wars of Europe took a different course, or they could be from an entirely separate realm, one that is connected to our own in ways that we do not yet understand. This theory draws heavily on ideas from quantum physics and the multiverse theory, which suggests that there may be infinite universes, each with its own version of reality. If this theory holds any truth, then the Phantom Army might not be a figment of imagination or a product of wartime stress. It could be the result of an intersection between our world and another. For all the fascinating and often mind-bending theories surrounding the Phantom Army, the question of why they appear at specific moments in history remains as elusive as ever. Why do these soldiers show up in moments of desperation, when the tide of battle seems hopeless? Why do they vanish just as quickly as they appear, leaving no trace behind, as though they were never there at all? The answer to this question might lie in the very nature of the Phantom Army itself, a force that exists not to change the course of history, but to remind humanity of the limits of its understanding. Perhaps the Phantom Army is not meant to alter the outcome of any particular battle, but to serve as a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that there are forces beyond our comprehension, forces that defy explanation and logic. In the end, the Phantom Army remains one of history's most enduring and enigmatic mysteries. Despite the many theories and explanations that have been proposed, it is likely that we will never know the full truth behind these spectral soldiers. Whether they are the result of psychological phenomena, divine intervention, secret rituals, or something entirely different, the story of the Phantom Army continues to haunt the edges of history, tantalizing us with its mysteries and challenging our understanding of what is possible. What we do know for certain is that the legend of the Phantom Army has persisted for centuries, a testament to the power of myth and the enduring allure of the unknown. Even today, the sight of a phantom battalion on the battlefield continues to captivate the imagination, and the questions that surround their appearances remain as unanswered as ever. As the Phantom Army legend took on greater complexity, it began to intersect with a range of other historical, cultural, and even spiritual forces, creating a web of connections that would prove difficult to untangle. From the perspective of the soldiers who witnessed the army's ghostly appearances, the question of its nature and purpose became a matter of profound mystery. Were these apparitions divine agents, sent to tip the scales of battle? Or were they manifestations of collective fears created by the turmoil of war? As more encounters were reported, the implications of these spectral soldiers began to grow in significance. The very idea of an invisible, intangible army that could alter the course of history seemed to challenge the most fundamental understanding of reality itself. Yet, it is precisely in these intersections, between the known and the unknown, between war and spirituality, between the physical and the metaphysical, that the deeper meaning of the Phantom Army begins to emerge. In the early stages of a legend, the appearance of these ghostly soldiers often seemed like a stroke of fate, a divine intervention that changed the course of the battle at a moment when all seemed lost. Soldiers on the battlefield, faced with overwhelming odds and certain defeat, began to see these figures as a symbol of hope, an answer to the prayers of the desperate. In the context of medieval and early modern Europe, where the church held immense power and influence, the notion that a spiritual army could appear to protect the righteous or punish the wicked resonated deeply. The idea that the divine, or some other supernatural power, could intercede in human affairs in this way was not out of place in the cultural milieu of the time. But as the centuries passed, the perception of the Phantom Army began to evolve. While some continued to view these appearances through a religious lens, others began to see the apparitions as something more ambiguous, something that could not easily be attributed to the will of any single divine force. These spectral soldiers began to take on a more complex character, one that defied simple categorization. Were they truly agents of a higher power, or were they simply reflections of human fears and desires? The line between divine and demonic, between good and evil, became increasingly blurred as soldiers from both sides of the conflict reported seeing these figures, often at moments when their own forces were on the verge of collapse. This ambiguity surrounding the nature of the Phantom Army is one of the most intriguing aspects of the legend. These spectral soldiers were not bound by the moral or religious divides that characterized the conflicts in which they appeared. They were not necessarily on the side of the victors, nor were they always aligned with the righteous cause. In fact, there were instances when the Phantom Army seemed to appear in ways that defied conventional expectations, as if its purpose was not to simply help one side win, but to inject a sense of unpredictability and chaos into the situation. This created an unsettling tension as soldiers began to wonder, was this army on their side, or were they simply part of some larger, incomprehensible plan? The complexity of this mystery only deepened as the Phantom Army appeared in increasingly diverse contexts. Though most reports centered around the great wars and battles of medieval and early modern Europe, sightings of ghostly armies were not confined to these conflicts alone. Throughout the centuries, strange accounts continued to emerge from various corners of the continent, each one adding layers to the growing mythos of the Phantom Army. These reports began to feature soldiers not just from the familiar conflicts of the past, but from later wars and even from the fringes of European society. The persistence of these sightings suggested that the Phantom Army was not merely a product of a specific time or place, but a timeless force, capable of appearing wherever and whenever it was needed. In some cases, the sightings of the Phantom Army were not tied to any specific battle at all, but were more generalized encounters that took place in the aftermath of war. Stories circulated of soldiers, having survived the horrors of battle, wandering through the ruins of devastated cities or through desolate battlefields, only to encounter strange figures standing silently in the distance, watching them with an unblinking gaze. These figures were often described as silent and motionless, as if they were simply observing the survivors from some distant, unearthly realm. There was something profoundly unsettling about these encounters, for they seemed to suggest that the Phantom Army was not a force that existed solely to change the outcome of individual battles, but a presence that lingered in the shadows of war, reminding those who survived of the ever-present specter of death. The impact of these encounters on the soldiers who reported them cannot be overstated. For many of these men, the appearance of the Phantom Army was not just an unsettling experience. It was a life-altering event that shaped their understanding of the world. Those who had seen the ghostly battalions often struggled to reconcile their experiences with the rational world around them. They returned from war, haunted by the knowledge that they had encountered something beyond the realm of human understanding. These soldiers were not merely dealing with the physical scars of battle. They were also grappling with the psychological toll of having witnessed something that defied all logic and explanation. For some, these experiences led to a deepening of their faith, as they saw the Phantom Army as a sign of divine intervention. For others, the encounters sparked a sense of existential dread, as they began to question the very nature of reality itself. As these stories spread throughout Europe, they began to take on a life of their own, evolving into a fully formed legend that would transcend individual battles and wars. The Phantom Army became more than just a series of strange sightings. It became a symbol of the chaos and uncertainty of war, a reminder that there are forces in the world that are beyond human control. The appearances of these spectral soldiers seemed to speak to something deep within the human psyche, a recognition that no matter how much power we may wield in the material world, we are ultimately at the mercy of forces that we cannot fully comprehend or influence. In the 19th century, as the age of industrialization and modern warfare dawned, the Phantom Army myth took on a new dimension. With the rise of new technologies, particularly the advent of firearms, cannons, and other weapons of mass destruction, war began to change in ways that had never been imagined before. The brutality and scale of modern warfare were unlike anything that had come before, and this transformation brought with it a new kind of existential anxiety. Soldiers were no longer fighting with swords and spears. They were facing increasingly mechanized and impersonal forms of violence that seemed to strip away any sense of humanity from the battlefield. The Phantom Army, in this context, began to take on a new role, that of a symbol of resistance against the dehumanizing forces of modern warfare. The idea that the Phantom Army was not just a force of supernatural origin, but a symbol of something deeper, the human need for hope, for meaning, in the face of overwhelming violence, became more pronounced. Soldiers who faced the horrors of industrial warfare, with its mechanized death and destruction, began to turn to the Phantom Army as a way of making sense of the chaos. The soldiers who appeared in the midst of battle were no longer just ghostly figures, but representations of something that transcended the brutal reality of war. They were symbols of the human spirit, enduring beyond the horrors of the battlefield, a reminder that no matter how much technology or violence could reshape the world, there were still forces beyond human comprehension, forces that could not be controlled or explained. This shift in perspective added a new layer to the legend of the Phantom Army, turning it from a tale of military intervention into a deeper meditation on the nature of warfare itself. The Phantom Army became more than just a tool for the righteous to call upon in their moments of need. It became a reminder of the enduring human need for something greater than the world of war and death. In a sense, the Phantom Army's appearances were not just interventions in the course of history, but messages from beyond, a reminder that even in the most chaotic, violent moments of history, there was something larger at work, something that defied understanding. As the years turned into centuries, the stories of the Phantom Army continued to evolve, becoming part of Europe's rich tapestry of myths and legends. Yet, even as these stories became more mythologized, they never fully lost their grip on the collective imagination. The idea that in the darkest moments of human conflict, there exists a force beyond human understanding, a force that can intervene to shape the outcome of history, remains a powerful and enduring myth. Whether seen as divine agents, products of collective fear, or symbols of the resistance against the dehumanizing forces of war, the Phantom Army continues to haunt the fringes of history, never fully explained, yet always present in the shadows. And perhaps that is what makes the legend so enduring. It is not just a story of soldiers from the past, but a story of the eternal struggle between humanity's desire for meaning and the chaotic forces that seem to govern our world. The enduring mystery of the Phantom Army, like so many great historical enigmas, has been compounded by the fact that no singular event or set of circumstances ever definitively explains its existence. Across centuries, cultures, and conflicts, the concept of a spectral military force, appearing out of nowhere to influence the course of history, has captivated the imagination of both soldiers and civilians alike. Yet despite the consistency with which these ghostly battalions have been reported, no conclusive evidence has ever been found to substantiate their existence, leaving behind only the tantalizing traces of legend. Some historians and scholars believe that the Phantom Army is a mere allegory, a symbolic manifestation of the human need to impose meaning upon the chaos of war. Others argue that these reports are so persistent, so widespread, that they cannot simply be written off as fiction. And still, others contend that the army is a reflection of a larger, spiritual or metaphysical reality that exists beyond the scope of our understanding, a reality that sometimes intersects with our own, at times when we need it most. At the heart of the Phantom Army myth is the question of its purpose. Why did this force appear in times of great peril, particularly during wars that seemed on the brink of catastrophe? Was it truly an intervention from some divine or supernatural realm? Or could the soldiers who witnessed these apparitions have been driven by something far more mundane, the overwhelming stress and trauma of war? As we consider this question, we find that the role of the Phantom Army shifts depending on the context in which it is viewed. For some, these figures were seen as messengers of fate, appearing when the tide of battle needed to be turned, whether for divine or diabolical purposes. For others, they were nothing more than the psychological product of war's many horrors, an embodiment of the fears, hopes, and desperation of soldiers locked in mortal combat. In either case, the very idea of an army appearing and disappearing at will, its soldiers neither fully alive nor entirely dead, presents a significant challenge to our understanding of reality. A key element of the Phantom Army's appeal lies in the idea that it appears at a critical juncture in history, at those moments when victory or defeat is hanging in the balance. The stories of its appearances are often tied to military engagements of great historical significance, battles where the stakes were high and the consequences catastrophic. In these moments, the soldiers on the front lines were under extraordinary pressure, facing not only the physical dangers of combat, but also the looming specter of death. In such circumstances, it is not difficult to understand how the human mind could seek to make sense of the chaos, whether by invoking the supernatural or by believing in the possibility of divine intervention. The soldiers who reported seeing the Phantom Army, often in the midst of battle or in its aftermath, were typically men whose lives had already been pushed to their breaking point. To them, the appearance of these soldiers could have been a last desperate hope for salvation, or, conversely, a sign that the very forces they were fighting against were more powerful and insidious than they could ever have imagined. Yet the reports of these spectral armies are not confined to soldiers in the heat of battle alone. In fact, some of the most chilling accounts come from individuals who encounter these figures in moments of profound solitude, after the battle had ended and the smoke had cleared. The survivors of war, wandering through desolate battlefields and ruined cities, have reported seeing the figures of soldiers standing silently in the distance, as if watching them from some otherworldly realm. These experiences, though less dramatic than those on the battlefield, are no less significant. They suggest that the Phantom Army was not merely a tactical force summoned to influence the outcome of specific conflicts, but a persistent and haunting presence that lingered long after the fighting had stopped. These figures were not bound by the realities of war. They existed outside of time and space, offering no explanation for their appearance, and no solace to those who encountered them. The significance of these encounters cannot be understated. For the soldiers who witnessed them, the experience was not merely a strange occurrence, but a profound event that would alter the way they viewed the world. These apparitions seemed to remind them of something larger than the conflict in which they were engaged. Whether they were perceived as angels, demons, or simply ghosts, the Phantom Army stood as a reminder of the tenuousness of life and the inevitability of death. For some soldiers, these encounters were a confirmation of the divine, an assurance that their struggles were not in vain and that higher powers were watching over them. For others, the appearance of these spectral figures was a terrifying realization that death was not the end, and that there were forces at work beyond human comprehension, forces that operated outside the bounds of moral or earthly logic. Interestingly, the encounters with the Phantom Army were not always framed within a religious context. Though many soldiers during the medieval and early modern periods would have seen the appearance of such figures as a sign of divine favor or wrath, there were others who approached the phenomenon with skepticism or even fear. For some, the figures were not seen as messengers from heaven or hell, but as manifestations of the chaos and confusion that characterized the battlefield. The very nature of war, the constant exposure to death, the sounds of battle, the overwhelming stress of survival, could have triggered a kind of collective hallucination, one that was shared among soldiers who had been pushed to their mental and physical limits. In these cases, the Phantom Army may have been seen as a reflection of the psychological and emotional state of the soldiers who saw it. It was not a real, tangible force, but a mental construct born out of the desperation and terror of war. In many of these accounts, the appearance of the Phantom Army was described with an unsettling consistency. The soldiers were typically dressed in the same manner as those from the era in which the reports were written, often wearing the armor and uniforms of their time, and moving with a sense of eerie synchronicity. Their faces, however, were almost always indistinct, as if they were more shadow than substance. This lack of detail further reinforced the idea that these soldiers were not real, physical beings, but rather spirits or projections of the mind. The very fact that these figures were often described as indistinguishable from the soldiers they were meant to help or hinder suggests that they existed not as separate entities, but as a mirror image of the soldiers themselves, a reflection of the fear, hope, and dread that defined the human experience of war. This ambiguity surrounding the identity of the Phantom Army is perhaps one of its most intriguing features. If these soldiers were truly supernatural beings, they would be expected to have some form of distinct identity. Perhaps they would wear the insignia of a particular army or bear symbols of divine power. But in the accounts that have survived, the soldiers are often described as indistinct, as if they were nothing more than projections of the soldiers' own minds, filtered through the lens of their wartime experience. This ambiguity speaks to something deeper about the human psyche, the idea that in the face of extreme trauma, we often create our own reality, shaping the world around us in ways that can be both comforting and disturbing. The psychological theory behind the Phantom Army, which posits that these apparitions were collective hallucinations or stress-induced manifestations, is further supported by the fact that many of the accounts come from soldiers who were not isolated but part of a larger group. In these cases, the soldiers did not experience the vision alone, but reported seeing the same figures as their comrades. This shared experience suggests that these encounters were not purely individual, but a collective event, something that transcended personal perception and was, instead, a product of the shared experience of war. The presence of these spectral soldiers seemed to confirm the collective fear and desperation that the soldiers felt, reinforcing the idea that the mind is capable of creating its own reality when faced with the horrors of battle. While these psychological explanations provide one possible answer to the mystery of the Phantom Army, they do not fully explain the phenomenon. The consistency of the reports, the clarity with which the figures were described, and the sheer number of eyewitness accounts suggest that there is more at play than mere delusion. The persistence of the Phantom Army legend throughout history, from one war to the next, indicates that the idea of this mysterious battalion has a deeper resonance, one that speaks to something inherent in the human condition. Perhaps, then, the true meaning of the Phantom Army is not to be found in its physical appearance, or even in its supernatural nature, but in the symbolic role it plays in the lives of those who encounter it. These soldiers, appearing at the most critical junctures of history, serve as a reminder of the fragility of human existence and the vast, unknowable forces that shape our world. They are a reminder that, no matter how much we may strive to control our fates, there are powers at work that remain beyond our understanding. The Phantom Army is, in a sense, a reflection of the human need for meaning in the face of chaos, a symbol of the eternal struggle between life and death, between the known and the unknown, and between the mortal and the divine. And in that sense, its legacy endures, continuing to captivate the imagination of those who seek to understand the mysteries of the past and the forces that shape our present. As the centuries passed and the stories of the Phantom Army spread across the European continent, they took on different shapes, reflecting the changing nature of warfare, society, and belief. What began as eerie reports of ghostly soldiers appearing during crucial battles evolved into a multifaceted myth that intersected with the cultural and philosophical currents of the time. From medieval religious fervor to Enlightenment rationalism, and later into the turbulent world of industrial warfare, the legend of the Phantom Army became more than just an account of strange sightings. It morphed into a symbol of deeper questions about life, death, and the unknown forces that shape human destiny. Yet, despite its enduring presence, the true nature of the Phantom Army remains as elusive as ever, slipping through the cracks of historical records, only to appear in fleeting moments of reflection and mystery. One of the most intriguing elements of the Phantom Army myth is how it reflects the nature of human consciousness, particularly in the context of war. War, by its very nature, is a traumatic experience. It forces individuals into life-or-death situations where the lines between the real and the imagined become blurred. In the chaos of battle, the mind is stretched to its limits. And in these extreme conditions, soldiers have historically been known to experience phenomena that defy explanation: hallucinations, visions, and even collective experiences of the supernatural. The concept of the Phantom Army fits neatly into this psychological framework, appearing at moments of overwhelming stress, where soldiers are caught between the threshold of life and death. But unlike other wartime hallucinations, the Phantom Army did not appear solely as a product of the soldiers' minds. These figures often seemed to have their own purpose, their own agency, and their own mysterious goals. The question, then, is not merely how these visions came to be, but why they appeared and what they represented in the grander narrative of human history. Some theorists suggest that the appearance of these spectral soldiers may be tied to an inherent need for hope and meaning in the face of utter despair. For soldiers, many of whom had seen friends and comrades fall in the most brutal and senseless of ways, the idea that there was some unseen force watching over them or intervening on their behalf provided a measure of comfort. The Phantom Army, in this context, could be seen as a manifestation of the soldiers' collective yearning for a savior, for some force that could tip the scales of fate and allow them to survive. As countless soldiers have testified, moments of war often felt like a test of fate, with the outcome determined by forces beyond their control. To witness the appearance of soldiers, seemingly from another realm, offering protection or turning the tide of battle, would have felt like an answer to that unspoken prayer for survival. The Phantom Army was a symbol of divine intervention, a promise that there was something larger than the human struggle at play in the world. However, as the myth of the Phantom Army evolved, so did its role in the minds of those who encountered it. The introduction of more secular philosophies and the rise of rationalism during the Enlightenment era led many to dismiss supernatural explanations for such phenomena. The rise of science, technology, and industrial warfare brought a new set of tools to the battlefield, and with it, a shift in the way war was perceived. The brutal, mechanized nature of modern conflict, exemplified by the massive death tolls of the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, and World War I, created a sense of alienation and detachment from the ideals of heroism and glory that had once characterized earlier conflicts. The Phantom Army, in this context, could no longer simply be seen as a divine or supernatural intervention, but had to be understood as a psychological or symbolic reaction to the horrors of modern warfare. Soldiers fighting in these wars were often described as cogs in the machine of industrialized combat, where individual action and agency seemed insignificant in the face of overwhelming technological forces. It was during these modern wars that the myth of the Phantom Army began to take on new dimensions, serving as a metaphor for the dehumanizing effects of industrial warfare and the loss of individuality on the battlefield. At the heart of this transformation lies the question of identity, both personal and collective. The soldiers who fought in these wars were no longer simply defending their homes or their beliefs. They were part of a larger mechanism, one that could easily be reduced to numbers on a battlefield. The Phantom Army, in this sense, represented a vestige of a time when war was fought with a sense of personal honor and the belief that individual actions could alter the course of history. The soldiers who saw the Phantom battalions were not only desperate for survival, they were also yearning for a connection to a past era, a time when war had meaning beyond the killing of men, when soldiers could believe that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Phantom Army, then, could be seen as a symbolic bridge between the past and the present, offering soldiers in modern wars a glimpse of something more profound, something that transcended the brutality of industrialized combat. The role of the Phantom Army as a symbol of war's psychological toll is further reinforced by the recurring theme of soldiers being haunted by their experiences. In many of the accounts, soldiers who survived battles reported seeing these spectral figures long after the fighting had ceased. The soldiers appeared in dreams, in quiet moments of solitude, or in the midst of other traumatic events. The idea that the Phantom Army could transcend the battlefield itself, appearing long after the war had ended, speaks to the long-lasting psychological effects of warfare. These apparitions were not merely visions of the past. They were reminders of the trauma, the loss, and the death that war left in its wake. The soldiers who saw the Phantom Army were not just confronting ghosts from the past. They were confronting the ghosts of their own minds, the lingering effects of trauma and fear that had followed them home from the front lines. This psychological interpretation of the Phantom Army, while compelling, does not fully explain the persistence of the legend or its impact on the historical consciousness. While soldiers may have seen such visions as a coping mechanism, the fact that the same kinds of reports have appeared across centuries, in different wars, and among different armies, suggests that something more profound is at play. The fact that the Phantom Army was not confined to a specific time or place points to the existence of a deeper cultural archetype, one that speaks to universal themes of mortality, fate, and the unknown. In this sense, the Phantom Army can be understood not just as a psychological manifestation, but as a collective myth, one that resonates with the shared fears and hopes of humanity. The Phantom Army also occupies an important place in the broader context of European history, particularly in the ways that the myths and legends of war have been used to justify or rationalize conflict. Throughout history, soldiers and leaders have often sought to explain the senseless violence of war in spiritual or metaphysical terms, framing battles as cosmic struggles between good and evil or as part of a divine plan. The appearance of the Phantom Army, in this context, can be seen as part of a larger tradition of using supernatural or otherworldly forces to provide meaning to war. By invoking the presence of such an army, soldiers and generals could, in a sense, validate the war they were fighting, giving it a sense of purpose beyond mere territorial conquest or political gain. The Phantom Army, then, was not just a symbol of hope for soldiers in battle. It was a tool for war itself, a way to make sense of the brutality and carnage that accompany conflict. However, the idea of divine intervention in war is not without its complications. As European societies evolved, so too did their relationship with the divine. The rise of secularism, the spread of Enlightenment thinking, and the growth of scientific understanding led to a decline in religious explanations for events. In this new world, the Phantom Army, once seen as a miraculous sign of divine favor, began to take on more ambiguous meanings. Some came to view the Phantom Army not as a force for good, but as a manifestation of something darker, a reminder that war, despite its outward justifications, is a chaotic, destructive force that ultimately serves no higher purpose. The Phantom Army, in this sense, could be seen as a symbol of the futility of human endeavor, a force that appears not to help but to complicate the moral landscape of war. The relationship between the Phantom Army and the human experience of war raises important questions about the nature of war itself. Is war merely a product of human ambition and conflict, or is it something deeper, something that reflects the underlying struggles of the human spirit? The Phantom Army, in its many forms, reflects this deeper question, serving as both a symbol of hope and a symbol of despair. In its spectral form, it represents the inescapable reality of death, and yet it also suggests that there may be forces at play in the world, forces that transcend our understanding, that can change the course of history when we need it most. Whether these forces are divine, supernatural, or purely psychological, the Phantom Army continues to serve as a reminder of the mysteries that lie beyond the human grasp and the complex, often paradoxical nature of war itself. In the end, the Phantom Army represents more than just a ghostly apparition on the battlefield. It is a reflection of the human condition, of our fears, our hopes, and our eternal struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems governed by forces beyond our control. Whether seen as a sign of divine intervention, a psychological coping mechanism, or a symbol of the inescapable realities of war, the Phantom Army remains one of history's most enduring and enigmatic legends, forever casting its shadow over the story of human conflict. The legend of the Phantom Army continues to captivate and intrigue, not just because of its mystifying nature, but because of the deep-seated questions it raises about the role of history, myth, and human perception. Across centuries, the myth has evolved and been woven into the very fabric of war's narrative. The idea of an invisible, otherworldly force intervening in human affairs is as old as war itself. But the stories surrounding the Phantom Army serve as a window into the complex psychological, emotional, and cultural responses to the chaos of battle. What is fascinating is how this myth transcends borders and eras, appearing in different historical contexts, yet always reflecting similar themes of desperation, fate, and the search for meaning in moments of overwhelming conflict. When we examine the continued persistence of the Phantom Army throughout history, we are forced to confront the deeper meaning of such apparitions. In times of war, soldiers and civilians alike are subjected to an existential crisis. Life itself seems fragile, and death becomes an ever-present shadow. In such moments, the human mind may seek solace in the supernatural, looking for a force beyond the carnage, a force that may offer protection, guidance, or even revenge. The Phantom Army, in its myriad forms, represents this very longing. Whether it was soldiers who reported seeing these ghostly figures appear on the battlefield, or civilians who heard tales of spectral armies influencing the tides of war, the common thread remains that the Phantom Army served as a bridge between the known and the unknown, a connection between the living and the dead, between history and mythology. The concept of a supernatural intervention is not exclusive to European cultures, yet it seems that in the context of European history, particularly during the medieval and early modern periods, the idea of divine or otherworldly forces affecting the outcome of battle was an accepted, even expected, part of the narrative. In medieval Europe, the idea that God, angels, or saints could intervene in the affairs of men was common. Battlefields were not just places of human conflict, but arenas where celestial forces waged their own kind of war. The appearance of the Phantom Army, whether it was seen as a sign of divine favor or as a warning of divine wrath, fit naturally into this worldview. For soldiers fighting in wars that often seemed endless and without purpose, the sudden appearance of these spectral soldiers served as a reminder that there was more to war than just human ambition or violence. It suggested that higher forces were at work, whether for good or ill, and that the outcome of the battle was in the hands of powers far greater than any human general or king. As the centuries passed, and especially during the Enlightenment period, the idea of supernatural intervention in the world of warfare began to wane. The rise of scientific thought, the embrace of rationalism, and the development of modern political and military strategies began to reshape how individuals and societies viewed the world. With this shift, the notion of divine forces intervening in battlefields seemed increasingly out of place, and many began to question the validity of such stories. The Phantom Army, though, remained persistent, appearing in various forms in different conflicts, including the Napoleonic Wars, the American Civil War, and even World War I. These appearances did not follow the traditional narrative of divine intervention. Instead, they took on more mysterious, ambiguous forms. What remained the same, however, was the profound psychological effect these apparitions had on those who encountered them. Modern warfare, with its technological advancements and impersonal mechanization, presented new kinds of horrors for soldiers. The early, more romanticized notion of battle, where soldiers fought side by side, relying on their individual courage and honor, gave way to an impersonal battlefield where the enemy was often unseen, hidden behind machines and distant artillery fire. This change had a profound impact on the soldier's psyche, as it removed much of the personal connection to the conflict. Instead of fighting a tangible enemy, soldiers now faced a nameless, faceless threat. The rise of industrial warfare, where millions of lives could be destroyed in mere moments, contributed to an overwhelming sense of alienation and fear. It was in this context that the Phantom Army's appearance took on a new significance. No longer merely a divine intervention, the Phantom Army began to be seen as something that transcended the traditional boundaries of war, existing outside the physical realm. It became less about the intervention of gods or spirits and more about the psychological need for something, anything, to make sense of the madness of war. The Phantom Army could be interpreted as a symbol of the soldier's desperate desire for meaning in a world where that meaning seemed elusive. One of the most striking features of these later encounters with the Phantom Army is the collective nature of the experiences. Soldiers often reported seeing the same figures at the same time, describing the same details with uncanny precision. This suggests that the appearances were not merely individual hallucinations, but shared psychological phenomena. It is as though the soldiers, in their desperation and fear, projected a shared vision of salvation or protection, creating a collective hallucination that bound them together in their moments of greatest peril. The idea that multiple soldiers, perhaps even whole regiments, could see the same apparition simultaneously calls into question the nature of the vision itself. Was it a supernatural manifestation that transcended the individual mind, or was it something that existed purely within the collective consciousness of the soldiers? Perhaps it was not a ghostly army at all, but a reflection of the soldiers' own inner fears and hopes, a projection of the universal human desire to find meaning and order in the chaos of battle. The appearance of the Phantom Army can also be interpreted as a form of psychological trauma. War, as many historians and psychologists have pointed out, can leave deep emotional and mental scars on those who participate in it. Soldiers who have experienced the horrors of combat often return home haunted by the memories of what they witnessed and the lives they took. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, once known as shell shock, is a well-documented consequence of war, and one of its most distressing symptoms is the experience of vivid flashbacks, nightmares, and hallucinations. The sightings of the Phantom Army could be seen as part of this psychological aftermath. The soldiers who saw the spectral figures may have been experiencing a form of collective PTSD, a condition triggered by the extreme stress and trauma of battle. The apparitions were not necessarily the result of a divine or supernatural force, but the mind's way of coping with the overwhelming reality of war. The connection between trauma and the Phantom Army myth extends beyond the battlefield as well. The soldiers' experiences were often shared with civilians, who began to embrace the legend of the Phantom Army in a more symbolic sense. For those who were not directly involved in the wars, but were still affected by the devastation they caused, the Phantom Army served as a reminder of the unexplainable aspects of war. It was not just the soldiers who witnessed these ghostly figures, but civilians who heard the stories, who saw the wreckage of the battles, and who felt the lingering effects of the conflict. In this way, the Phantom Army became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of the human cost of war and the need for a higher power to intervene in moments of crisis. Whether the stories were shared around a campfire, in the halls of government, or in the writings of poets and novelists, the Phantom Army grew into a powerful cultural myth that connected all those who had been touched by the war experience. It is important to note that, while the Phantom Army legend is most commonly associated with European warfare, similar phenomena have been reported in other parts of the world. In times of great conflict, people from different cultures have reported seeing spectral warriors or armies appearing at the critical junctures of battle, offering aid or warning. From the ghosts of fallen samurai appearing in feudal Japan to the spirits of Native American warriors guiding their descendants, the concept of an otherworldly force intervening during times of war is a global phenomenon. This universality speaks to something deeply rooted in the human psyche: the need for protection, the desire for divine intervention, and the quest for meaning in the face of death and destruction. The Phantom Army, whether it is called by that name or another, represents a shared cultural archetype, the belief that, in the most desperate moments, we are not alone. Another aspect of the Phantom Army legend that deserves consideration is its connection to the idea of fate. In many accounts, the appearance of the ghostly soldiers coincides with turning points in the battle, moments when all seemed lost and the forces of victory or defeat hung in the balance. The Phantom Army appears just when it is needed most, as if guided by an unseen hand, and it tips the scale in favor of the soldiers who encounter it. This sense of fate, the idea that the battle's outcome is not entirely in human hands, adds a layer of fatalism to the legend. It suggests that, no matter how much we struggle and fight, there are greater forces at work, shaping the outcome of events in ways that we cannot control or understand. The Phantom Army, in this sense, serves as a reminder of the fragility of human agency, the recognition that there are forces in the world that operate outside of our comprehension, forces that can sometimes change the course of history with a single appearance. As with all great legends, the Phantom Army represents more than just a supernatural phenomenon or a product of collective trauma. It embodies the universal human struggle to understand our place in the world, to make sense of the chaos that surrounds us, and to find hope in the face of unimaginable suffering. The mystery of the Phantom Army is not just in its spectral appearance or its otherworldly nature. It is in its power to capture our deepest fears, hopes, and desires, and to reflect them back at us in a way that transcends time and place. The legend persists because it speaks to something timeless in the human spirit: the need for meaning, for protection, and for the assurance that, even in the darkest, the myth of the Phantom Army has been a subject of fascination for historians, military scholars, and folklore enthusiasts for centuries. It is a tale that transcends the borders of time and space, remaining an enduring enigma throughout the ages. While many would argue that these stories are simply the result of human imagination at work, the consistency and persistence with which the accounts of spectral soldiers appear in the historical record make it impossible to ignore. Over the years, the idea of an invisible army intervening in the course of history has captivated the collective imagination, speaking to something deep within the human psyche. What makes this myth even more intriguing is not just the notion of supernatural intervention, but the questions it raises about fate, power, and the mysterious forces that govern our lives. To consider the Phantom Army in a historical context is to engage with the very nature of war itself, the way it shapes not only the physical world, but also the minds and souls of those who witness and participate in it. At its core, the Phantom Army is a paradox, existing between two opposing realities. On one hand, it is a ghostly manifestation, something that cannot be physically touched or measured, something that seems to belong to the realm of the supernatural. Yet, on the other hand, it is a presence that feels deeply real to those who encounter it, one that shapes the course of history in ways that defy explanation. For the soldiers who reported seeing these spectral forces, there was often no ambiguity. The Phantom Army was not just a figment of imagination, but a tangible, real entity that changed the outcome of their battle. It was a presence that shifted the tides of war, appearing in the moments of greatest desperation and offering a glimmer of hope when all seemed lost. This duality, simultaneously unreal and profoundly real, compels us to ask, what exactly are these apparitions, and why do they appear in times of great strife? The story of the Phantom Army is intimately tied to the human experience of war. It is no coincidence that these sightings often occur in the midst of extreme conflict, at the very moment when the brutality of war seems to strip away all pretense of meaning or reason. War is a crucible that tests the limits of human endurance and morality. And in such moments of intense stress and trauma, the mind begins to break down the barriers between the physical world and the psychological realm. It is in this blurred space between reality and perception that the Phantom Army appears. But this is not merely a psychological phenomenon. It is also a reflection of the deeply held need for meaning in the face of senseless destruction. Throughout history, soldiers have long turned to supernatural explanations for the events unfolding around them. In the chaos of battle, where death is ever-present and the stakes are impossibly high, the human mind often reaches for something beyond itself, a higher power, a divine force, or a supernatural entity, to explain the random and violent forces that dictate life and death on the battlefield. The Phantom Army, in its various forms, provided that explanation. To see these figures was to see a sign, a symbol that there was something greater at work in the world, something that could intervene and tip the balance in favor of the righteous. For soldiers caught in the maelstrom of battle, this was a deeply comforting thought. It suggested that they were not alone, that there was a higher purpose behind the violence, and that, somehow, the universe was watching and intervening.